Minimum wage negotiations are as hard as a rock. And tonight, Babajide Ogunsowo, founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's data analyst, is right here to share more insights about the outlook on the minimum wage situation in Nigeria. Babajide, great to have you on the News at 10 again.
Good evening, Ayotunde.
All right, so have recent changes in Nigeria's national minimum wage been reflected, in the survival of Nigerians? What can you tell us? What are the facts, even as we speak?
I think it depends on how we want to look at it. But I'll ask you a question, and I want you to listen carefully to this. Would you rather prefer to be on the 125 minimum wage in Nigeria of the 80s, or will you take the 62,000 naira proposal that we have today? Just think about it, and I'll come back to you later on it. But today, tonight, it's about minimum wage discussions, but I have some good news and some bad news. But I'd like to start with the bad news because it's important. We live in a country today that journalists, reporters, and analysts are being persecuted. Journalists, reporters, and analysts like me are being persecuted for putting our skills, gifts, and talents towards a safer, stronger, and more united Nigeria. And I'll explain this a bit more much later. But let's start with labor and the analysis and what the common man is talking about. Ayotunde, there are three things the common man is talking about regarding this labor discussions. The first is, do we have a minimum wage, a poverty wage, or is it a living wage, or indeed a suffering wage? Number one. Number two is, how are we handling these labor discussions? In simple terms, are wages classified, and are we seeing wages as an expense, or are wages investments? Tunde, the third, final, and perhaps the most important point is if we take a look at the Constitution, Section 16, subsection 2D, it talks about the national minimum wage, but there's one word that comes before a national minimum wage. This Constitution talks about a reasonable national minimum wage.
The word reasonable.
The word reasonable comes before national minimum wage. And so the question is, how do we measure the reasonability of the minimum wage? One way to look at this, Ayotunde, is for us to take a look at what the status is in terms of, like you asked, is the minimum wage reflecting in the standard of living of Nigerians? And not me, but the World Bank provides that answer. In their report that measures the gross domestic product, which in simple terms is a proxy, the gross domestic product per capita, a proxy to measure the standard and quality of life. They say that compared to where Nigeria was in 2014, that year that a lot of Nigerians, that year that the common man felt things were bad and a new government and opposition really gained popularity, they say the GDP per capita of 2014 is better than what it is today. That is from the World Bank. So let's take a look at that table that allows us to see where we were in 2014 and where we are today, especially relative to other large African economies. And here are the exact numbers from the World Bank. They say, compared to 2014, Egypt, Kenya, and Ghana have seen a growth in their gross domestic product per person on a purchasing power parity basis. We see that growth in Egypt, 24% relative to 2014, 20% in Kenya, and 18% in Ghana, 8% in Morocco. What about Algeria, South Africa, and Nigeria? We see declining numbers. In Nigeria, GDP per head in 2014, based on the World Bank's report, shows $6,197. And based on their most recent figures for 2022, they say that has declined by 9%. It is now $5,670. So in simple terms, we are saying that our wages and the wages of a common man has been insufficient for him to have a higher quality of life. That is the fact, and those are the facts that we will keep talking about. because it is the truth.
So what's the situation across the largest economies of Africa? I mean, talking about this minimum wage.
You know, we'll go into the other countries in Africa, but we need to understand the impact of the minimum wage in Nigeria. The National Bureau of Statistics puts the size of the economy to 230 trillion naira. You heard me, 230 trillion naira. That is the size of the Nigerian economy, Ayotunde. But the number I'm more interested in is, what is the contribution of families like you and I in terms of spending? And it shows that families like you and I account for approximately 70% of the size of the economy. So in simple terms, if you want to grow the economy of Nigeria, you have to grow the income and the quality of life and spending of Nigerians. It's that straightforward. Let's look at the situation of the minimum wage across other African countries, especially if you look at the equivalent of what their minimum wage is in dollar terms. Yes, we understand that cost of living varies across these countries. However, this is the report and this is the situation as of today. Morocco, minimum wage $370, an equivalent of $370 per month. South Africa, the equivalent of $250 per month. Algeria, the equivalent of $145 per month. And look down to where we are in Nigeria today. A 30,000 naira minimum wage is the equivalent of $20 per month. But you might ask, Ayotuni, why is this so important? And I'll explain why this is important. The minimum wage is similar to the war we are fighting against terrorists. The minimum wage, and why do I say it's a war? It's a war to keep and attract talent. The minimum wage is a proxy of measuring the willingness of people to stay, the willingness of people to japa. In most times, the minimum wage as well acts as a proxy to measure the median wage. And so it allows not just Nigerians, it allows foreigners to decide, is Nigeria a country you want to come and work? That is why these discussions, I call them, it's war. A war to keep talent, a war, Ayotunde, to attract talent.
So let's look at the situation really for the way forward. Why are we even talking about all this? I mean, what should determine the new minimum wage going forward?
You know, and I hope the president is listening. I hope his advisors are listening.
Because you know, we have the organized private sector, government, and of course labor, all trying to, you know, come together at the negotiating table, and of course, you know, come up with some parameters.
You know, I started by asking you that would you rather live in a Nigeria of 1981 when the minimum wage was 125 naira per month, or would you rather live in a Nigeria with a potential 62,000 naira per month? The analysis is clear. What 125 naira per month will buy you, 62,000 naira will not get you. Let me put it in context. There are perhaps two ways and two memos that the president will be dealing with. The first memo, Ayotunde, if we were to look at deciding a minimum wage based on the exchange rate, and I want you to please listen carefully to me. In 2019, April 18, 2019, when President Jonathan signed the minimum wage bill, the minimum wage which became Act, 30,000 naira, April 18, 2019, 30,000 naira was the equivalent of $93. And I was here to do the analysis. Today was the equivalent of $93, 140,000 naira. And so if you put that in front of the president, I would say, if we want to keep things the same as it was in 2019, it was the equivalent of $93, we'll be looking at a minimum wage of about 140,000 naira. And so clearly the president will most likely put that memo by the side. The second memo, let's take a look at inflation rates. Going by the facts from the National Bureau of Statistics, the report shows April 18, 2019, on the day President Jonathan signed the minimum wage of 30,000 naira. Looking at the inflation rate between that date and now, based on inflation, the minimum wage, keeping it at par, will be the equivalent of 75,000 naira. And so Ayotunde, we're in a situation whereby, an awkward situation, whereby we are likely going to move our minimum wage forward. However, an upward review of this new minimum wage is likely going to take us backwards. It's a very strange situation whereby an upward review of our minimum wage, we are likely going to end up backwards. Because, like I said, 30,000 naira of 2019, based on inflation terms, is the equivalent of 75,000 naira. We are not talking about a minimum wage of 75,000 naira today. Based on the exchange rate, a 30,000 naira minimum wage, based on the official exchange rate of then, a 30,000 naira minimum wage, $93, is the equivalent of 140,000 naira. And we're not talking about that today. So we're in that situation where this minimum wage, an upward review, is likely going to take us backwards. Let's take a look at these numbers and exactly what has happened in history, because it allows us to put that in perspective, and then we'll finally end with some good news. The chart of the week. Here are the facts. 1981, 125 minimum wage.
That was under Shagari's administration.
Exactly. As at then, you could get $1 for 61 kobo. In 1995, 3,000 naira minimum wage, but you could get $1 for 22 naira. In 2011, with an 18,000 naira minimum wage, you could buy $1 for 155 naira. And so we're in this situation whereby we're waiting for this new minimum wage, but what is certain, based on what the organized private sector and the government is negotiating for, is 62,000 naira. This upward review is likely going to take us backwards. But here's the good news, Ayotunde. Despite the challenges, like I talked about, journalists, researchers, analysts like I are facing, despite these persecutions, the president says, and if you take a look at what his goal is, he says he understands these challenges, and he talks about his vision of a Nigeria still remaining crystal clear. That is some good news. However, we understand the challenges that lie ahead of him. Like I said, we're in a situation where our upward review of a minimum wage is likely going to end up putting us backwards.
Well, definitely we'll leave it at that. Babajide Ogunsanwo, thank you for your thoughts on the news at 10.
The pleasure is all mine.